A free and tolerant Catholic. That sounds like a bit like an oxymoron, doesn't it? A contradiction in terms. It's widely assumed that to be a Catholic is to surrender your freedom of thought and heart. You don't have to use your mind. Church has got all the answers. It's done the thinking for you. So, 17th century Enlightenment saw that it was as a liberation from the chains of Catholic dogma. Winston Churchill was hardly a convinced Christian. In fact, he describes himself as supporting the church like a flying buttress from the outside. And he even played with the idea of becoming a Muslim. But one thing he knew for sure was that Catholicism was bad for you. It enslaves your mind. Now, it's true that the church has often been, and sometimes still is, unthinking and intolerant. This is true of every institution, including Oxford University. But I want to suggest that Catholic doctrine, dogma, properly understood, is the very opposite of dogmatic in its modern, narrow sense. It summons us to engage with a mystery which is always beyond our grasp. It proposes truths which are gifts, but we never master them. And the truths of our dogma don't wrap things up. They provoke us to pray and to think, and will do so until the end of time, when we shall see God face to face. And I will also argue that the church is indeed sometimes intolerant, but it challenges the even more profound intolerance of contemporary society. Dogma, strictly speaking, is just a small part of what the church teaches, but it's the heart, the inalienable core of our faith. These are the truths which the church has defined infallibly as part of our faith, and many of them to be found in the Creed. So the church could never, for example, decide that Jesus, after all, wasn't really divine. He was just a jolly decent chap. And we could never deny that he rose from the dead. That would be to dynamite the rock on which we are built. Though there were 3 archaeologists who were digging outside Jerusalem, members of different religious orders, a Dominican, a Franciscan, and a Jesuit. And they came across a 1st century tomb. And inside it was the body of a crucified man. And horror of horrors, when they looked closely, they found there was a bit of wood which said, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And the Dominican said, how awful, my beautiful theology is not true. And the Franciscan wept and he said, oh, the joy of St. Francis was without foundation. But the Jesuit smiled to himself and he said, well, he did exist after all. G.K. Chesterton maintained that all human beings are dogmatic. He said there are only 2 kinds of people, those who accept dogmas and know it, and those who accept dogmas and don't know it. Now, we Christians, we Catholics, I should say more precisely, we know what our dogmas are. And they are beautiful because they do not wrap up the truth. They precisely prevent us from doing so. They propose a truth which is always beyond our tight grasp, which we shall always be seeking to understand and failing to do so. Take the Council of Chalcedon, for example, which gave us the beautiful dogma of that Jesus was truly human and truly divine. This doesn't mean to say that we can now say, oh, well, now we know who Jesus is. We got that wrapped up. We've cracked his identity once and for all. What's next? The beauty of the doctrine, of this teaching, is precisely that it pushes us beyond any narrow little understanding of who Christ is. Before the Council of Chalcedon, there were some people who were utterly convinced of the humanity of Jesus, particularly people coming from around Antioch, but they couldn't make much sense of his divinity. But he had to be human if he was to save us. And there were others coming more or less from around Alexandria, northern Egypt, who were utterly convinced that we were not saved unless he was God. But they really couldn't make much sense of the idea that he was human. What happened at Chalcedon was that the church pushed us beyond either narrow understanding of Jesus. Either way alone was too small. But it didn't give us an explanation of how he was both human and divine. And theologians have always articulated this in all sorts of different ways. And we shall forever go on struggling to understand the mystery. As I said, it's a truth that is given, but we never master. It's like climbing a mountain. You think that the next rise is the summit, but when you get there, there's another one. As Gregory of Nyssa said in the 4th century, you go from beginning to beginning to beginning. And it's the same with another great doctrine of the church, the Trinity. It looks like a rather peculiar celestial mathematics, like how many angels can you fit on a pinhead? But it's not making a mathematical statement. As if you were to ask, how many planets revolve around the sun? In heaven, we won't be able to look around and spot 3 members of the Trinity. Oh, there's the Father. I rather think that's the Son over there. Now, where's the Holy Spirit? A true story I was told last week when I was in Seattle by a Vietnamese Dominican. He'd had this bright idea during his Pentecost sermon that when he gave a sign, the sacristan should release a white dove, which sort of fluttered around the church. And when the moment came, he gave the sign, but nothing happened. And he waited, and then a voice shouted out, "Father, Father, the cat's eaten the Holy Spirit." Again, you see, the dogma of the Trinity doesn't wrap up the truth of God. You know, here it is, it's sorted now. Next. Rather, what it does is it pushes you towards a mystery of love, which is eternal, overflowing beyond itself, the utter, equal love of Father, Son, poured out in the Spirit, a love which is completely free from domination or hierarchy. The truth of the doctrine of the Trinity is not about 3 people living a long way away, as if we were speaking about 3 people, stray alien beings living on Pluto. It's a mystery that we live every day. St. John wrote, "Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. Everyone who is born, everyone who loves is born of God and knows God." And it's the most practical, down-to-earth teaching that you can imagine. It is relevant to all our attempts and failures to love in a way that respects the equality and the dignity of the other person. It's a daily challenge for every Christian. Again, you go from beginning to beginning to beginning. St. Augustine said, "Show me a lover, and he will understand what I am saying. You could put it the other way around. Show me a lover, and I will try to understand what he or she is saying. And so we need the help of everyone who struggles to understand what it means to love, regardless of whether they're Christians or not. Reading novels and poetry, going to films, talking to friends, trying to love people. All this is part of our apprenticeship in the mystery of the Trinity. But what about tolerance? Does religious belief make us intolerant? All over the world, you can see people being slaughtered by other believers with different views. Christians and Muslims, Sunni and Shia, Hindus and Buddhists. I was in Iraq recently, just before I went to the States, and you could see the massive slaughter, particularly of Muslims by each other. It is undeniable that religion is used to fuel hatred all over the world. But this is not because religious people are bigoted and intolerant, but because of a particularly modern temptation, which is towards fundamentalism. There are scientific fundamentalists who believe that the great mystery of human consciousness can be reduced to electrical currents in the brain, and that love is no more than a mechanism for passing on your genes. Maybe somebody like Richard Dawkins is a sort of scientific fundamentalist. I've never actually read his work, so I may be being unfair. There are economic fundamentalists who believe that everything can be reduced to the working of the market. And there are also religious fundamentalists who think they've got it all sorted. But dogma is the great antibody to the virus of fundamentalism, because it invites us to humility in the face of the mystery. St. Thomas Aquinas famously wrote that in this life we are joined to God as to the unknown. Last December I had the extraordinarily wonderful privilege of taking part in a summit organized at the Vatican for Sunni and Shia Muslims and for Catholic and Episcopalian or Anglican theologians. We had everybody there. We had Ayatollahs, we had a Jordanian prince, bags of cardinals, Anglican bishops. But what was fascinating is we weren't seeking the lowest common denominator. In fact, we were trying to get a glimpse of the highest ineffable mystery. And one of the Sunni scholars quoted a prayer from Babylon 800 years before Christ. O God, whom I know and do not know. If we didn't know, we would have nothing to say. If we didn't not know, we'd have nothing to learn. So the great truth seeker, certainly in the Catholic tradition, inspired by our dogmas, is humble of heart and mind. St. Dominic said that he understood everything because of the humility of his mind. It's only those who Teresa of Avila called the medio letrados, the half-learned, who think that they're superior to everybody else. Simon Tugwell, one of my fellow novices, said that these are those people who know enough to think they know everything, but not enough to know that they know almost nothing. The person who searches for the truth, he says, whether academic or not, is precisely the babe, the person who knows that he or she is at the beginning, not at the end of the road. So I believe, and in my experience, Catholic dogma invites us to humility of heart, and it challenges intellectual intolerance. But what about a more general intolerance of each other? One of the triumphs of modernity is a profound desire to get beyond the prejudices of the past and give us space for everyone. When I was a teenager, British society was filled with prejudice. Class prejudice, racial prejudice, male superiority, anti-Semitism, the rejection of gay people. I grew up in a wonderful family, but there was a profound prejudice against socialists. If you wanted to be really rude about somebody, you said, "Do you know that chap is a dreadful socialist?" For most young people, that intolerance is completely incomprehensible. In theory, anyway. And this offers a challenge to the church, which has often fallen into prejudice. Our collusion with anti-Semitism is shameful, and our rejection of gay people has been dire. And Pope Francis has called upon the church to become the house of the Father, with doors always wide open, where there's a place for everyone, with all their problems, and to move towards those who feel the need to take up again their path of faith. And that synod that the church held last year, and the synod that will continue the work this year, is trying to understand and digest that challenge. How do we become a home for everyone, for divorced and remarried, for gay people, for all the infinite variety of humanity? But the church needs to challenge the dominant understanding of tolerance. It's usually understood to mean that anybody can believe anything because their beliefs are unimportant. Gay or straight, male or female, Christian or Buddhist, even, for goodness sake, English or French. What does it matter? We're all just the same. So why shouldn't gay people marry, for example? And why care about differences of religion? Deep down, it's held that there isn't really any difference. And this looks like a profound tolerance. It seems to echo St. Paul's words to the Galatians, that in Christ there's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female. But authentic tolerance delights in difference and is enriched by it. It really means that it bears, etymologically, that it bears difference. Richard Sennett of New York University argued, Western society retreats from difference. We fear it. Because of growing inequality and a fluid society in which people move rapidly from one job to another, if they can get a job at all, we don't learn the art of living with people who are unlike us. And so we're afraid of difference. Zygmunt Bauman of Leeds and I think Warsaw University said the mobility of modern society encourages the impulse to withdraw from risk-ridden complexity into the shelter of uniformity. And the internet reinforces this tendency to hang out with the like-minded. On Facebook, and I saw this morning I had 731 pending requests for friendship. You indicate your likes and preferences and you find people who share them, whether in China or Chile. Thumbs up emoji. And if you disagree, you disconnect. You're spared the friction of dealing with people with whom you disagree. So the internet connects us to a sort of planetary community, but it enables us to disconnect from the people next door with whom we may have difference and who could help us to grow up. The tolerance, the so-called tolerance of modernity, is actually profoundly intolerant of real difference. Religion's all right as long as it's private and unimportant. Well, it's okay if it's sort of folkloric, then ornamental. It's great that Jews celebrate Hanukkah and Muslims celebrate Eid. but rather less acceptable that we Christians celebrate Christmas, lest other faiths feel excluded. So in Oxford we have the Festival of Light. The tolerance of our society is in fact profoundly intolerant. Now it's true that inside the church too, we're often afraid of engaging with real difference. Conservative and progressive Catholics can be deeply intolerant of each other. Jesuits and Dominicans in the past have often been combative. Herbert McCabe, our brother of this priory for many years, liked to say, "I love the Jesuits, but I would not want my daughter to marry one." But the church is called to be a place where we are unafraid to face and even embrace difference. Because the whole life of the church is founded on difference and unity. The New Testament embraces difference with an almost reckless enthusiasm. I think it was in the 2nd century really, there were attempts by some people to reduce the 4 Gospels to one coherent account. But the church realized we had to live with difference between the Gospels. I was talking about this with Bishop Kenny, our local bishop, a couple of days ago before I went to Rome. And he said he'd been in a prison trying to explain to the prisoners why it was not terrible that the Gospels disagreed with each other. And one of the prisoners said, "Of course they disagree. We in prison, we all know that if the witnesses agree, then it's all been fixed." If you go back to the great doctrines of our faith, say the divinity and humanity of Christ and the Trinity, they're both about difference and unity. We believe in Jesus, the Son of God, who embraces in his very being the biggest difference that you can ever imagine, which is the difference between the divine, utterly transcendent, and humanity. Divinity utterly transcends all that's created, and yet he's one. Not because it's a muddy muddle or a mixture, but as the Council of Chalcedon declared more than 1,500 years ago, 2 natures which exist without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. Or think of the doctrine of the Trinity. This is not, one God with 3 aspects, or 3 gods who happen to have a vague unity. It's a radical unity in difference. So how does the church negotiate the difference and unity, which is at the very core of our belief? In part, it's because we have a very unusual belief these days, not widely shared. We believe in reason. One of the great dogmas of the First Vatican Council was its declaration of a belief in reason. And because we believe in reason, we believe that differences can be recognized and argued about intelligently. Difference can be explored and can illuminate. We can converse. Often we don't, Theologians often try to poison each other, slip something in the chalice. But when we are true to our doctrines, we can talk. Pope Benedict made a wonderful speech at Regensburg in which he urged us to recover the grandeur of reason. And not a reason which is narrowly scientific, which is perfectly valid in its limited sphere, but a reason which is imaginatively open to the deepest questions of our existence. Pope Benedict said, "The courage to engage the whole breadth of reason and not the denial of its grandeur. This is the program with which a theology founded in biblical faith enters into the debates of our time. And so, I see exactly just 8:30. We are called to be tolerant precisely as Catholics. And it's not that easy-going tolerance of rubbing along, as if we're all just the same. That'd be boring. It's a much more challenging tolerance, which is humble in the face of other people's convictions, and humble in the face of God. And when we find that we do disagree, well, that's wonderful. Let us then reason together, and we got a chance of learning something. Thank you very much.